The animal had been returned 4 times. One family said he was cursed. Another swore he stalked their children at night. Everyone agreed on one thing: Popcat was dangerous. But that winter, when a girl named Emily stepped into the shelter, carrying nothing but guilt and a broken sketchbook, something changed, and for the first time in years. Popcat didn't hiss. He watched. He waited. And then he chose before we begin this unforgettable story. Would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Snow had started falling thick and fast by the time Emily Prescott turned onto the winding road that led to the outskirts of the small mountain town of Fair Hollow, Colorado. The sky was pale gray, heavy with silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath beneath the thick quilt of white. Pines stood dusted in frost like old men in church pews, still and reverent. Her tires crunched over the slush-blanketed gravel as she drove past shuttered stores and frosted windows, headed toward the one place that never seemed to close, the Fair Hollow Animal Rescue Center. Emily, 26, with a tall, willowy frame and ash-blonde hair tied in a messy bun beneath her green beanie, had only moved to Fair Hollow a month prior. Her face still held the aftershocks of heartbreak, soft under-eye shadows, and a gaze that often wandered into memory. A graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, Emily was a painter who had lost her passion after a devastating breakup and the sudden illness of her grandmother. She had moved back to care for Merrill Prescott, once a vivacious librarian known for her love of cats and storytelling. Now bedridden and voiceless after a stroke had stolen her words. She hadn't planned to stop at the shelter, but as the snow thickened and her hands grew numb inside the car, something pulled her in, a flicker of intuition. Perhaps, or just the memory of her grandmother's soft whisper years ago. Animals find us when we're lost too. The shelter sat low among the snowbanks, its sign nearly buried inside. The air was sharp with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the unmistakable scent of caged fur. A hum of heaters buzzed overhead, struggling to hold warmth against the creeping cold. Rows of metal cages lined the narrow room, each holding a pair of watchful eyes or restless paws, but Emily's gaze was drawn to the far corner, to a cage partially covered with a dark blanket. There, curled tightly in the corner of the cage, was a creature that looked more shadow than cat, large, muscular, and lean. The feline's coat was a rosette-spotted blend of silver gray and charcoal, its body coiled as if every bone was braced for impact. Its tail was wrapped tightly around itself like a shield, but it was the eyes that rooted Emily to the spot. Brilliant amber yellow, not with warmth, but with the glitter of survival. Eyes that had watched too many leave and too many betray. The sound of boots on tile pulled her attention. A woman in her 50s approached, short and stocky, wearing a shelter vest and a tired smile. Looking for a companion, she asked. Her name tag read Sarah. Sarah had the kind of face that had aged from worry more than time. Laugh lines carved deeper by years of frowns. She had worked at the shelter for nearly 2 decades and had seen animals come and go, but few had affected her like the one in the corner cage. Her tone softened as she followed Emily's gaze. "Ah, that one. That's Popcat." Emily blinked. "Popcat." Sarah nodded. "Yeah, ridiculous name, right. He was named by a YouTube rescue page. Got passed around like a hot potato ever since. Half Bengal, half Bobcat, or so they think. About 4 years old. Been returned 4 times in less than 2 months." Emily crouched down, her eyes level with the cage's bars. Popcat didn't hiss, didn't blink. He just stared. Sarah squatted beside her. He destroyed a couch in under 2 hours. Scratched a teenager across the face in another home, broke a window, attacked a Labrador, and cornered a child in a bathroom. She paused. But he doesn't bite unless he feels trapped. The vet says he's not aggressive, just damaged. Emily slowly extended a hand, stopping just shy of the metal. Has anyone ever tried to understand him? Sarah looked at her for a long moment. A few tried, none stayed long enough. Popcat sniffed the air. He didn't retreat, but he didn't move forward either. Slowly, cautiously. He leaned closer. His nose touched Emily's finger, just once, and then he turned his head and curled tighter into himself. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Emily stood. I'll take him. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. You're serious? She nodded. Yes, I don't know for how long, but I want to try. Later that afternoon, with the adoption papers signed and Popcat secured inside a large, reinforced carrier, Emily drove back through the snow-blanketed town toward the old family home perched on the hill. The house smelled like cedar and old tea, and from the front window, a silhouette watched, a woman with a quilt over her knees and a long braid of white hair trailing over one shoulder. Meryl Prescott, 78, once known as Miss M to every child in the Fairhollow Library, had been struck speechless by a stroke 3 months prior. She now spent her days in silence, eyes flicking between books she could no longer read and the clock she no longer followed. Her doctors had said she might never speak again, but Emily refused to give up hope as she entered the house. Popcat still silent inside the carrier. Meryl's eyes moved. They landed not on Emily, but on the creature in the crate, for a breathless second. Something flickered there, recognition, or maybe curiosity. And in that fragile flicker, Emily dared to hope. The wind howled against the window panes as Emily closed the front door behind her, bringing the snow and cold to a halt just outside the threshold. Inside, the house felt warmer than she remembered, but not because of the heating. It was something else, a tension, an alertness in the air, as if the very walls were waiting to see what would happen next. Popcat's carrier sat at the center of the foyer like a silent bomb. Emily unlatched the door and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single paw extended, followed by the sleek, low body of the feline. Popcat moved like a shadow with eyes, his rosette-speckled coat rippling as he slinked across the wooden floor and disappeared beneath the living room couch without a sound. Emily sighed and pulled off her boots, brushing melting snow from her coat. She was tired, not physically, but in the kind of soul-deep way that came from being constantly on edge. Her fingers lingered over the doorknob for a moment before she turned and headed toward the kitchen to check on her grandmother. Meryl Prescott lay propped against a mound of pillows on a reclining chair by the bay window. Her face, soft and pale like porcelain, remained turned toward the door, eyes half-lidded with quiet alertness. The oxygen tube at her nose hissed gently, the only sound in the room. "I brought someone home," Emily said softly. She reached for her grandmother's hand, thin, cold fingers that hadn't moved of their own will in weeks. "His name is Popcat. He's complicated." There was no answer, of course, but Emily noticed her grandmother's eyes blinked, slowly, as if registering the change in atmosphere. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps not. The next few hours were quiet. Too quiet. Emily prepared a small bowl of food and a litter tray and placed them near the edge of the couch, hoping Popcat would come out on his own terms. But the only signs of life were the occasional scrape of claws beneath the furniture and the occasional guttural warning growl when she passed too close. As evening fell, Emily lit the fireplace, letting the flicker of flames chase back the shadows that seemed to have multiplied throughout the day. She tried to work on a sketch but found her hands trembling too much. The sound of her pencil scratching the page seemed to disturb Popcat, who let out a low, rattling hiss from the shadows. Later that night, long after she'd checked on Meryl and curled under a quilt on the living room couch, she awoke to the sound of something tearing. Her heart jumped. She sat up. The room was dim, only lit by the dying embers in the hearth. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and then she saw it. Popcat, crouched over what remained of the armrest. The fabric had been shredded, the foam spilling like intestines onto the rug. He paused only when he noticed her watching. "Popcat," Emily whispered, her voice cautious, pleading. The cat arched his back, letting out a guttural warning growl. She froze. Popcat stared for a long moment before retreating back under the couch like a ghost disappearing into the floorboards. Emily sat there for hours, unable to sleep again. Her mind kept returning to the warning from the shelter, to the scars in Popcat's history. But there was something deeper at play. He wasn't just lashing out, he was terrified. Sometime after 3 May, a strange sound broke the silence. It wasn't the growl of the cat or the creak of the house. It was a sound Emily hadn't heard in weeks, the soft, involuntary rustling of fingers on fabric. She ran to the bedroom. Meryl's hand had moved. Her fingers twitched against the blanket, curled slightly, and then fell still again. But it was enough. Emily dropped to her knees beside her grandmother. Tears suddenly stinging her eyes. Was it Popcat? Could his presence, his primal voice in the darkness, have sparked something inside her grandmother's mind later that morning, while brewing tea? Emily remembered a box stored in the attic, a collection of old books and keepsakes her grandmother had kept since the 1970s. She fetched a flashlight and climbed the narrow wooden ladder. Dust choked the air. The floor creaked beneath her steps. Inside a trunk wrapped in faded lavender fabric. She found it, a worn leather-bound journal labeled Observations and Reflections. It was her grandmother's handwriting. She flipped through pages filled with elegant script, drawings of cats in curled positions, little sketches of paw prints, ink smudges where tea had spilled. Some entries were simple: dates, weather, the name of a neighbor's cat. But some were deeper: philosophical reflections about animals, their capacity for silent understanding. One passage caught Emily's eye. "I've long believed cats carry memory not just of this life, but many. They are bridges between silence and healing. A truly broken human needs a truly wounded cat. Their scars sing in the same key." Emily sat in the attic until her legs went numb. She reread that line until the words blurred. Perhaps this wasn't just about a cat. Perhaps Popcat was here not to be saved, but to help save. She returned to the living room where the couch remained torn and the food untouched. Popcat hadn't emerged. She read aloud from the journal softly, not expecting a response but hoping. The flick of a tail beneath the couch was the only reply. That evening, a knock came at the door. Standing on the snowy porch was a man in his late 30s, bundled in a thick red coat, snow clinging to his boots. His name was Troy Dalton, a new nurse from the local health center assigned to assist with home care visits for patients like Meryl. Troy had kind eyes, a round face with a hint of stubble, and moved with the careful precision of someone used to handling fragile things. He introduced himself quickly, explaining that he had experience with stroke patients and was here to monitor vitals and discuss in-home support. Emily led him inside and warned him about the cat. He's unpredictable. Troy chuckled. "Aren't we all?" he said with a warm smile. That, for the first time in days, made her relax. He bent to check Meryl's pulse and gently lifted her wrist. "Strong." He nodded. "Do let me know if you notice more changes, even small ones. Sometimes the brain finds strange ways to reach back." Emily didn't mention Popcat. Not yet. Troy returned every other day. Each visit, Popcat would lurk just beyond sight, his yellow eyes peeking from shadows, watching with quiet menace. But he didn't growl, and one time, just as Troy stood to leave, Popcat slinked into view and sat at the edge of the hallway, still, silent, like a stone statue carved in tension. The snowstorm swept in like a clenched fist over Fair Hollow, its icy winds clawing at rooftops and bending pine trees with the weight of their fury. Emily stood by the front window, her breath fogging the glass, watching the town disappear beneath an avalanche of white. The power lines swayed under the growing pressure until, with a single audible pop, the house fell into darkness. It was past 7 p.m., but the sky was already pitch black, and the temperature inside began to drop rapidly. Emily wrapped herself tighter in her wool shawl, moving quickly to light candles across the living room. The fireplace was lit, but the flickering flames only cast eerie silhouettes that danced along the walls like restless spirits, somewhere under the couch. Popcat stirred. The silence after the blackout was deeper than usual. No hum of appliances, no distant traffic. Just the howl of the storm outside and the sporadic creaks of wood contracting in the cold. Emily placed extra blankets in Meryl's room, checking her grandmother's vitals and whispering softly, though she knew Meryl couldn't respond. The old woman's eyelids fluttered, barely, as if acknowledging her granddaughter's presence. In the hallway, Popcat's low growl rolled out like thunder. Emily turned just in time to see him bolt across the room, crashing into the table and knocking over a stack of sketchbooks. His eyes were wide, body arched, tail fluffed. The wind had rattled a window shutter loose outside, and the noise had sent him into a frenzy. Emily dropped to her knees, trying to calm him, but Popcat darted past her again, his claws leaving fresh gouges in the floor as he slid into the kitchen and knocked over a trash bin. Dishes clattered, a glass shattered. He hissed at a cabinet corner as if it had betrayed him. His panic was complete, wild, feral, unrelenting. "Popcat, please." Emily's voice cracked, but it was no use. In the span of 10 minutes, the living room had become a war zone. Throw pillows torn open, candlelight flickering over toppled furniture. Emily sank to the floor near the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. Exhaustion pressed in like a second skin. Her throat ached from unshed tears. Her hands trembled from more than cold. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply sat in the center of the chaos, eyes unfocused, breath ragged. The storm outside roared louder, mocking the stillness inside. Then she heard it, a sound so soft she thought she imagined it. The scratch of claws on hardwood, but slower this time. She didn't look up. Then came the whisper of fur brushing fabric, the weight of something small and warm pressing against her leg, and finally, the softest exhale, like a sigh from another lifetime. Emily looked down. Popcat was there, not crouched to attack or flee, just resting his chin on her ankle. Tail wrapped around his body like a belt of trust. His amber eyes blinked slowly once, then closed. A silent truce had been drawn. No violence, no demands. Just two creatures, broken in different ways. sharing warmth on a night when the world had turned to ice. She didn't dare move, not even to wipe the tears that now streamed freely. Eventually. Popcat curled beside her hip, his breath slow and even. Emily laid her hand on the floor near his paw, but didn't touch. She didn't need to, that night. They both fell asleep there on the hardwood, cocooned in the glow of flickering candles and the quiet truce of exhaustion, sometime past midnight. Emily woke with a start. The fire had dimmed, casting the room in deep shadows. Popcat was still beside her, but his ears had perked. He was staring down the hallway. A sound echoed faintly. It came again, a low, rasping moan, human, weak, unfamiliar and yet impossible to misinterpret. Emily stood up on instinct, blood rushing in her ears. She hurried to the bedroom where Meryl lay under her knitted quilt. The old woman's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, but her lips were parted. It wasn't a word, not quite, but it was sound from her. For the first time in weeks, Emily stepped closer, heart hammering. Just a vibration of breath and voice, but Emily fell to her knees beside the bed. Grandma, are you trying to say something? Meryl's eyes didn't open, her hands didn't move, but the sound had been real, alive, pulsing with something ancient and buried. Popcat padded into the room, silent as snowfall, and leapt gracefully onto the edge of the bed. He didn't approach Meryl, but sat facing her, tail curled over his paws like a sentry. Emily watched him and felt her breath catch. Was it coincidence, or had something passed between them? Something she couldn't name but could feel in her marrow later that morning. Once the storm had passed, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the ice-covered trees, Emily made tea in silence. The living room still bore the scars of the previous night, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt lived in, shared. Popcat followed her movements from his perch on the windowsill. No longer hiding. His posture was still guarded, but his gaze was no longer feral. There was curiosity in it now, and something else. Emily returned to the journal later that day and found a new page she hadn't noticed before, tucked between two dog-eared entries. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. In some winters, warmth is not found in fire, but in the stillness of a creature who chooses to stay beside you when it could flee. The storm had passed, leaving the town of Fairhollow glazed in a glittering silence. Sunlight filtered through the icicles clinging to the eaves, casting fractured rainbows on the frost-covered ground. Inside the Prescott home. The fireplace crackled with a soft rhythm, and Popcat lay stretched near its warmth, tail flicking gently as he watched the flames dance. Emily sat at the kitchen table, leafing through the mail that had been delayed during the storm. Most of it was junk, local circulars, insurance reminders, and old holiday coupons, but one manila envelope stood out, addressed in uneven block letters. No return address. Her name, Emily Prescott, was scrawled with an urgency that tugged at her attention. She opened it. Inside were photocopied documents, medical files, facility intake logs, 2 grainy black and white photographs, and a handwritten note. You don't know me, but I knew the cat. We called him Specimen RSA-17. He was kept at Shady Pines Wildlife Experience, just off Route 12. They shut it down after a raid. He was drugged daily to pose with tourists, kept in a 3x3 cage, no sunlight, no silence, just flashbulbs, just noise. He remembers more than he shows. He was there too long. J. Emily read the note again, then looked toward Popcat. He had his head tucked beneath his paw, but one eye cracked open under her gaze, a scar beneath that eye. barely visible beneath the fur, curved like a crescent moon. She had assumed it was from a fight. Now, it felt more like a wound carved by history. She spread the photos on the table in one. A younger popcat, leaner, sharper, cowered in the corner of a narrow cage. Ribs pronounced. Eyes wild with a glint that mirrored the stormy creature she'd brought home weeks ago. The other photo showed a child, maybe 5 or 6, clutching Popcat against a bright green screen backdrop. The animal's ears were pinned back, and his eyes were screaming. Emily stood, the chair scraping loudly behind her. Startling Popcat. He hissed softly but didn't move. She whispered an apology and walked to the laundry room. Within the hour, she dismantled every crate, pet carrier, and enclosed bin in the house. She even removed the closet doors in her own room. Anything that might trigger the feeling of captivity was stripped away, piece by piece, when she was done. The home felt strangely open, exposed, vulnerable, but so was Popcat that evening. As the house settled into its usual hush, Popcat entered Meryl's room without hesitation. The old woman was propped up by extra pillows, a cup of warm broth resting on her bedside table. Her hands had regained a slight tremble, not enough to hold, but enough to reach. Her eyes lit up when Popcat leapt onto the foot of the bed. Emily stood in the doorway, not daring to break the moment. Popcat moved slowly, each paw silent against the quilt. Until he reached Meryl's side, he paused. Then, almost lazily, he rubbed his head against her thin wrist. It was the softest of gestures, but it stirred something deep. "Goo, din." Meryl's voice rasped. It wasn't much louder than breath, but it was unmistakable. Emily rushed forward, tears forming instantly. "Cat," came the second word, breathier, weaker, but deliberate. "Good. Cat." Popcat didn't flinch. He remained beside her, curled now against the bony rise of her hip, as if he'd been lying there all his life. Emily knelt beside the bed, her hand gently clasping her grandmother's. "You're back," she whispered, voice trembling. "You're coming back." From the corner of the room. A soft knock echoed. It was Troy, the home nurse. He had returned for his scheduled evening visit, his heavy coat dusted with fresh powder. He paused when he saw the scene inside. Troy was a man of few assumptions. Stocky with a warm smile, and a voice that held the slow patience of someone who'd worked too long in silent rooms. He had dark brown eyes, always focused yet never imposing when he stepped into the room. It was with reverence, not curiosity, he approached quietly. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Glancing at Meryl, Emily stood and nodded. "She spoke," she said. Just 2 words, but she spoke. Troy's eyes widened, and for the first time, a genuine grin lit up his face. "That's more than I've seen in weeks with most stroke patients," he said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." His gaze shifted to Popcat, who now blinked slowly up at him, as if evaluating this new visitor's worth. Troy didn't move closer. He simply gave a respectful nod, after checking Meryl's vitals and updating her file. Troy lingered for a few minutes, standing in the hallway. "Mind if I ask where the cat came from?" he finally said. Tone gentle. Emily hesitated, then told him about the shelter, about the multiple returns, and finally about the file she'd received that morning. Troy listened quietly, absorbing every word. "Trauma's a strange thing," he said afterward, "in people, in animals. It never really leaves, but if something makes them feel safe enough, sometimes the healing begins." He didn't press further. He never did. That was part of what Emily had begun to appreciate most about him, his way of making space without crowding it. after he left. Emily returned to the kitchen and opened her grandmother's journal again. She flipped to the back cover, where a single sentence had been scribbled years ago in the red pen, underlined twice. Cages aren't always made of bars. She closed the journal slowly, then glanced at the couch where Popcat now dozed, his tail curled beside his nose, for the first time since she'd moved back to Fair Hollow. Emily didn't feel like she was waiting for her life to restart. It had already begun, quietly, unexpectedly, with a scarred cat, a silent grandmother, and the memory of a cage that no longer existed. 2 months had passed since the blizzard. The days in Fair Hollow had grown longer, the white of winter melting slowly into the sepia of early spring. A thin mist hung over the pine groves in the morning, and the air carried the scent of thawing bark and wet stone. Birds had begun to return, not in flocks, but in hesitant pairs, just enough to lend the mornings a soundtrack again. Popcat now greeted the sunrise from his chosen spot on the porch. He sprawled across the old wicker chair just outside the front door. Amber eyes narrowed in satisfaction, coat gleaming in the light like brushed silver. He was no longer the unpredictable creature that hid beneath furniture and tore through the walls of the house with feral panic. There was calm in him now, a kind of ancient, earned stillness. Every evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Popcat would pad through the hallways, silent and certain. To Meryl's room, he would leap onto the bed without waiting for invitation and rest beside her, pressing the side of his body against her frail hip. It had become their ritual, and Meryl, her voice still weak but steadier each week, now welcomed him with a smile and a few whispered words. "You're here again." Emily had watched all of it unfold, sketchbook in hand. She had begun drawing again, not for clients, not for deadlines, but because it was the only way she knew how to preserve these moments. The house, once cold and cluttered with grief, now lived in her sketches. Popcat curled on the sill, Meryl's frail fingers stroking his ear, Troy smiling gently in the hallway, the light falling across Emily's own shoulder as she painted from memory. She had converted the attic into a small studio. The room was cramped and filled with slanted light, but it breathed with warmth. Dozens of pieces lined the walls, small studies of paws, shadows, wrinkles in linen, fur caught in candlelight, but at the center, framed by bare wood and quiet reverence, stood one large canvas. Popcat curled in a crescent between Meryl's hands, and Emily's arm wrapped protectively around them both. The piece was titled Silent Bonds. It would become the anchor of her first gallery show in nearly 2 years, held in a repurposed church-turned-art space at the edge of town. The space, named Hollow Light, was owned by a widow named June Callahan, a tall, silver-haired woman with strong shoulders and an eye for melancholy art. June had lost her husband 10 years prior and turned her grief into a platform for local artists who worked with themes of healing, memory, and place. She wore hand-knit scarves and always smelled faintly of dried lavender. Her voice was low, smooth and unhurried. When Emily brought her the portfolio, June studied each piece in silence. Then she looked up and said simply, "You've been through something." Not a question, an observation. Emily nodded. "I think we all have. Popcat just reminded me." June agreed to host the show on the spot as opening night approached. Emily found herself nervous, not because of the art itself, but because of what it meant. Each brushstroke was not just observation, but confession. These weren't just paintings. They were evidence of change. Meryl, though still mostly homebound, insisted that Emily go forward with the exhibition. She had regained more speech over the last few weeks, now able to string together full sentences, albeit slowly and often hoarse. "I want people to see what love does," she said one afternoon as Emily adjusted a fresh blanket across her lap. On the evening of the exhibit, Emily wore a forest green dress and her mother's silver pendant. Troy arrived early to help set up, carrying a bouquet of dried thistle and white chamomile for strength and calm. He explained with a sheepish smile. His presence had become steady in their lives, not romantic yet, but quietly devoted, always offering, never imposing. The gallery filled slowly. Locals drifted in, teachers, artists, retirees. Sarah from the shelter came too, her wiry frame now wrapped in a red coat, her face alight with disbelief as she stood in front of Popcat's portrait. "I never thought he'd be like this," she whispered. Emily didn't have to explain. The art said enough. Halfway through the evening, Emily stepped outside for air. The wind had picked up, cool and sweet with early spring, and she turned just in time to see Popcat. He was sitting at the edge of the walkway, having slipped out from the car where Troy had gently transported him. Just to be close. He sat like a statue, not needing to enter, only witness. Emily crouched down and met his eyes. No words, just a breath of recognition, a thread of knowing. Then she reached out her hand, and Popcat leaned forward, pressing his forehead to her fingers. Sometimes, healing doesn't arrive with noise or fanfare. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a silent creature who chooses to stay. In the story of Emily, Popcat, and Meryl, we are reminded that broken souls, whether human or animal, can find peace when love is patient, and when someone chooses not to give up. Popcat was not a pet, he was a miracle in fur, sent perhaps not by chance but by design, what if. In every wounded animal, God hides a purpose, what if. Through every small act of kindness. He works quietly, repairing what the world has broken. This story is a quiet testimony that no creature is beyond redemption. That in the stillness of a winter night, through the paw of a once-forgotten cat. Grace can move, hearts can change, and lives can be reborn. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and tell us how animals have changed your life. Write Amen if you believe God still sends us miracles in the most unexpected forms. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the quiet beauty of love, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you and every soul that crosses your path, furry or not.